It began on a frozen morning in a quiet coastal town where snow erased footprints almost as quickly as they were made. Every day, at the same hour, a small figure appeared from the fog, an 8-year-old girl walking in silence, surrounded by 5 powerful German shepherds, moving like trained guardians. No shouting, no leashes pulled tight, just discipline, trust, and something that unsettled everyone who watched. Some people whispered that it was dangerous, others said it wasn't natural. They wondered where her parents were, why she never spoke, and how such a small child could command dogs bred for rescue and protection. But what no one knew was that the dogs weren't following her out of obedience alone. They were protecting her from something far deeper than the winter cold. And when one of those dogs sensed a failing heartbeat before any human could, the town was forced to face a truth it had tried to ignore. This wasn't a story about fear. It was a story about faith, loss, and a quiet miracle walking beside us every single day. Before we begin, please like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Your support truly means everything to us. Winter arrived quietly in Port Haven, Maine, the kind of cold that crept in before dawn and settled into bones, with fine snow drifting sideways on a salty wind from the harbor. Out of the fog came 5 German shepherds, moving with unsettling precision, their bodies aligned into a shallow arrowhead formation, paws crunching in rhythm on the iced pavement. They were large dogs, all muscle and discipline, coats ranging from deep sable to black and tan, each around 4 to 6 years old, bred and trained for work rather than companionship. Their ears were upright, constantly adjusting, reading sound the way sailors read tides. Their eyes, amber, brown, almost gold, scanned storefronts, alley mouths, parked cars. They did not pull, they did not wander, they advanced like a unit that understood purpose. At the center of them walked a child. Harper Lane was 8 years old, small for her age but not fragile. Her build was wiry, the kind earned by cold air and long walks rather than playgrounds. Her hair was chestnut brown, cut blunt at her jaw, practical and uneven as if trimmed with kitchen scissors. Pale winter freckles dusted her cheeks, standing out against skin kept fair by months without summer sun. She wore a navy blue puffer jacket that had once belonged to an adult and now hung loose at the shoulders, a gray wool hat pulled low over her ears, black snow pants stiff with salt stains, and heavy boots marked by dried harbor slush. Her face held no smile, but it also held no fear. Her expression was focused, inward, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Harper did not speak. She did not need to. When the lead dog drifted a half-step too far right, she rotated her wrist once, barely noticeable, 2 fingers brushing the cuff of her sleeve. Instantly, the dog corrected course. At the corner of Wharf Street, she paused, heel down, toes angled slightly inward. All 5 dogs halted in the same heartbeat, bodies squared, heads forward, waiting. It was not obedience born of dominance. It was fluency. They were not following commands. They were responding to a shared language. People noticed. A fisherman unlocking his bait shop muttered a laugh under his breath. That kid's got better control than the Coast Guard. A couple from out of town stopped mid-step, phones half raised, then hesitated, unsettled by the quiet authority of the scene. A mother tightened her grip on her son's mittened hand. "Where are her parents?" she whispered, not quite accusing, not quite concerned. Across the street, behind the fogged glass of Marlowe's market, Gwen Marlowe watched. Gwen was 64, tall and narrow-shouldered, with silver blonde hair pinned into a rigid bun that never shifted no matter the weather. Her posture was immaculate, spine straight from decades of correcting classrooms and committees alike. Her face was angular, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that rested naturally in disapproval, though those who knew her well insisted she simply had standards. She wore a camel-colored wool coat buttoned to the throat, leather gloves folded neatly beside the register, and sensible shoes polished even in winter. Order mattered to Gwen. It always had. She had raised 2 children who moved away, married, and called on holidays. She had chaired the parent council for 14 years, organized fundraisers, enforced rules with a smile that left no room for argument. Chaos, in her mind, was simply negligence wearing a disguise. She leaned closer to the glass, eyes narrowing as Harper and the dogs passed. "No leashes," she murmured. "No supervision." Gwen did not see grace. She saw liability. She saw a child exposed to danger, a town exposed to risk, and beneath that, something that unsettled her more deeply than she would ever admit. A girl who did not behave as children were supposed to, commanding forces far larger than herself, with a confidence that did not ask permission. "That isn't normal," Gwen said to no one in particular. "Children don't live like that unless something is wrong." The dogs paused again at the crosswalk. One, the largest, a sable male with a scar along his muzzle, shifted subtly to Harper's left, positioning his body between her and the road. Another mirrored the movement on her right. Harper waited for the light, breath fogging softly in the cold. When it changed, she stepped forward and the formation flowed with her, seamless. What no one on that street could see was the storm inside her. Harper's silence was not empty. It was crowded. Sounds lived there, metal screaming, glass shattering, her mother's breath cut short by impact, her father's voice calling her name and then stopping. Words had tried to leave her mouth once, months ago, and had failed, collapsing inward like a bridge under snow. After that, she had stopped trying. Silence was safer. Silence did not break. The dogs knew this. They knew the way her heartbeat spiked when a truck engine backfired, the way her shoulders tightened at sudden laughter, the way her fingers trembled when memories surfaced without warning. They adjusted without instruction, closing ranks, slowing pace, grounding her in the present with the steady rhythm of pause on pavement. To them, Harper was not broken. She was clear. At the end of Main Street, the harbor opened up, gray water rolling beneath a skin of ice. Fishing boats knocked gently against their moorings, bells chiming softly. Harper stopped at the edge of the pier and rested her gloved hand briefly against the shoulder of the nearest dog. The contact lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Her breathing steadied, the dogs relaxed by a fraction, ears still alert but tails lowering slightly. The work momentarily done. Behind her, unseen, Gwen Marlowe made a decision. She straightened, smoothed her coat, and reached for her phone. If no one else was willing to ask questions, she would. If a child was being neglected, it was her responsibility to notice. That was what good people did. That was what order required. As Harper turned back toward home, snow thickening in the air, Port Haven shifted around her, invisible lines forming between neighbors. Some would watch with admiration, some with fear, some with judgment sharpened by certainty, and at the center of it all walked a quiet girl and five disciplined shadows, unaware that this morning ritual, born of necessity and trust, had just begun to unravel a town. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, as if the winter itself were holding its breath. The house stood at the edge of Port Haven like a memory that refused to be renovated, a weather-beaten wooden structure with gray shingles curled at the corners and salt-stained windows that rattled whenever the harbor wind grew impatient. Snow gathered along its porch rails and settled into the grooves of old footsteps, each layer recording winters that had come and gone without asking permission. Inside this house, warmth existed, but it was the careful warmth of rationed fuel and aging bones rather than comfort. Harper Lane had once filled spaces like this with laughter. It had been an easy sound then, bright and unguarded, the kind that startled adults into smiling without realizing it. That version of Harper lived in summers and photographs now. 1 year ago, her world had shattered with the sharp finality of glass meeting stone. Her parents, Evan and Molly Lane, were not famous, but in northern Maine's rescue circles, their names carried quiet respect. Evan was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a trimmed, dark beard that always showed hints of frost in winter. His face was all angles softened by patience, the kind of man who spoke little but listened deeply, especially to animals. Years of hauling ropes and lifting survivors from icy terrain had given him thick forearms and a permanent crease between his brows, carved by responsibility rather than anger. Molly, by contrast, was slender and quick-moving, her auburn hair usually braided tight to keep it out of the way. Her skin freckled easily and her eyes, clear green, rarely missed anything that moved. She laughed more than Evan did, but when she worked, her focus became razor sharp. Together they trained rescue dogs to read snow collapse patterns, track human scent through freezing wind, and sense the subtle vibrations of unstable ice. The night they died, they were driving through a mountain pass to assist with a late emergency call. Black ice. A curve taken too fast. Headlights swallowed by snow. Harper had been asleep in the back seat, cocooned in blankets. She survived without a scratch. Her parents did not. Words tried to come afterward. They rose like breath in winter and vanished before taking shape. Doctors said her vocal cords were fine. Her mind simply closed the door. Silence became the only place where memories did not bleed. Now Harper lived with her grandparents. Walter Lane was 71 and carried his age like a burden he refused to set down. He had once been tall, but time and illness had rounded his shoulders, giving him a slight forward tilt, as if he were perpetually bracing against wind. His hair was thin and white, always neatly combed, and his hands trembled when he reached too quickly. A cardiac condition had turned exertion into risk, cold air into an enemy. Yet his eyes remained kind, blue, and observant, and when Harper met them, she found neither pity nor pressure there, only concern softened by love. Irene Lane was 69 and shorter than her husband, with thick silver hair she kept pulled back in a loose knot that shed pins throughout the day. Arthritis had settled deep into her joints, especially her knees and fingers, warping them into shapes that no longer obeyed her will. Her face bore the lines of someone who had worried often and laughed less than she deserved. She moved slowly, deliberately, measuring every step, every reach. But her voice remained warm, and when she spoke to Harper, she did so gently, as if afraid a harsher tone might fracture something already fragile. And then there were the dogs. 5 German shepherds occupied the house with the quiet confidence of professionals off duty. Atlas, the largest, was a sable male with a broad chest and a faint scar tracing his muzzle. 4 years old and already carrying himself like a veteran. His movements were deliberate, economical, his presence grounding. Juno, slightly smaller and female, had a darker coat and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She was the thinker, always watching before acting. Bear, thick-necked and black-backed, moved with surprising softness for his size, his loyalty expressed through proximity rather than force. Sable was leaner, faster, her tan markings brighter, her energy tightly coiled beneath discipline. Knox, the youngest at just over 3, still carried traces of youth in his curiosity, though it had been tempered by training and loss. They were not pets, they were family. They were memory made flesh and fur. Walter and Irene worried constantly. The dogs required food, exercise, structure, things that aging bodies struggled to provide. On fixed incomes, every bag of kibble meant a calculation, every vet visit a quiet fear. They worried the dogs would lose sharpness, that neighbors would complain, that authorities would ask questions they could not easily answer. Above all, they worried about Harper, about whether clinging to these animals was helping her heal or anchoring her to grief. Harper worried about none of that. Her worries were simpler and heavier. She worried about mornings when her grandfather's breathing sounded wrong. She worried about her grandmother's hands swelling until they could not fasten buttons. She worried about the dogs growing restless, confused, their training eroding like footprints under fresh snow. Most of all, she worried about losing them too. The attic became her refuge. Up there, beneath slanted beams and dust-thick air, she found her parents again, not in photographs, but in ink and margins. Evan and Molly's training journals were stacked in a sealed crate, their pages dense with diagrams, coded notes, and personal observations. Evan's handwriting was blocky and precise. Molly's flowed, looping with urgency. Harper studied them nightly by flashlight, lying on her stomach with pages spread around her like a map. She memorized signals, adapted them to her smaller frame, simplified motion so the dogs could see them clearly, even in low light. Where her parents had used voice commands layered with gesture, Harper stripped sound away entirely. The dogs responded as if they had been waiting for this. They learned her pauses, the angle of her wrist, the way her shoulders tightened when she needed them close. They learned the difference between fear and memory, between hesitation and command. With them, Harper did not feel broken. She felt fluent. That morning, when the snow fell heavier than usual and the cold pressed hard against the windows, Walter's breath had grown shallow after only a few steps across the kitchen. Irene watched him grip the counter, knuckles whitening, and fear flickered through her tired eyes. She did not see Harper slip into the hallway, nor did she hear the quiet resolve forming in the child's chest. Harper moved with practiced efficiency. She retrieved the leashes, clipped them together, and secured them around her waist, the way she had seen her father do when hands needed to remain free. She pulled her jacket zipper to her chin, tugged on her hat, and knelt briefly to meet Atlas's gaze. He lowered his head a fraction, acknowledgement passing between them without sound. She opened the door. Cold rushed in, sharp and clean. Snowflakes brushed her cheeks like fingertips. The dogs stepped forward with her, formation settling naturally around her small frame. Behind them, in the dim kitchen, Irene sank slowly into a chair, her hands pressed to her mouth as realization dawned. Walter reached for the window, watching as Harper led the dogs down the porch steps, her boots crunching steadily. "She didn't ask," Irene whispered, her voice shaking. "She didn't say a word." Walter swallowed, his chest tight for reasons that had nothing to do with his heart. "She didn't need to," he said quietly. "She's doing what Evan would have done." Outside, the town stirred. unaware that this simple act, this child stepping into the snow with 5 loyal shadows, had shifted something fundamental. It was no longer just about survival within the walls of an old wooden house. It was about visibility, about risk, about a silence that would soon be tested by voices far louder than Harper's own. As the door closed behind them, and the wind erased their footprints almost immediately, the dogs tightened their formation. Harper walked on, unaware that this choice, made out of love and necessity, was already echoing beyond the harbor, carrying consequences none of them could yet imagine. Port Haven did not change overnight. It tilted slowly, the way ice shifts before it breaks. Harper adjusted her routes in the days that followed, choosing alleys that smelled of salt and rope, cutting behind shuttered sheds, skirting the long curve of the harbor where gulls screamed and no one lingered. The dogs adapted without comment. Atlas took point. Juno ranged her eyes across windows and corners. Bear stayed close enough that his shoulder brushed Harper's sleeve. Sable paced the edges with quiet speed, and Knox learned when curiosity was a luxury they could not afford. Still, Port Haven was small. People learned schedules the way fishermen learned tides. Soon there were watchers at corners, some smiling, some filming, some frowning with the practiced certainty of those who believed fear was the same as foresight. Officer Caleb Sutter began following from a distance on the 3rd morning. He was 38, tall and broad through the shoulders, with a square jaw and a beard kept short enough to look intentional rather than lazy. His hair, dark with early threads of gray, was always tucked under a knit cap pulled low against the cold. Caleb moved with the steady economy of someone who had learned the cost of haste years ago, back when a split-second decision on a winter highway had ended a pursuit and nearly ended his career. Since then, he watched first, acted second. He kept his hands open when he spoke, palms visible, voice even. To the dogs, he was another shape in the landscape. To Harper, a presence that neither pressed nor pried. He noted how the girl stopped at every crossing, how the dogs formed a living crescent around her when engines roared past, how Atlas consistently positioned himself half a step between her and traffic. "That's not bravado," Caleb said later to a colleague over weak coffee. "That's rescue training." Gwen Marlowe disagreed, and disagreement for her was an engine. The concerned coffee gatherings took shape in her dining room beneath a chandelier polished weekly, whether it needed it or not. Gwen presided in tailored sweaters and pearl studs, her posture straight, her tone calm but firm. She spoke of exposure and liability, of a child alone in winter with animals capable of harm, of grandparents too frail to supervise. She spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. A few nodded, others hesitated, glancing at their mugs. Fear moved faster than nuance. Rumors bloomed. Harper didn't attend school. Harper had been raised feral. The dogs were one startled child away from disaster. None of it came from malice. It came from imagination untethered from evidence. The incident at the harbor happened on a morning when the wind cut like glass. A tourist, Martin Hale, mid-40s, pale from an office life and dressed in a brand-new parka that still creased when he moved, stepped onto the wooden pier to take a photograph of the frozen water. His boots slipped on black ice, hidden beneath a dusting of snow, and his momentum carried him toward the edge. He windmilled, breath bursting out in a startled shout. Bear reacted first, surging forward to block the path while Knox darted in, shoulder-checking the man's thigh hard enough to stop him without toppling him. Martin staggered backward, heart hammering, arms flailing. Atlas froze Harper in place with a single look. Juno flanked. Sable cut off the open side. No teeth showed. No growls followed. The entire exchange took seconds. It was long enough. Someone screamed. Phones came up. A voice yelled, "Call the police." Martin sank onto a crate, shaking, insisting he hadn't been bitten, that he'd slipped, that the dogs had stopped him. His words were swallowed by adrenaline and the sight of 5 powerful bodies, too close for comfort. Fear does not wait for permission. By the time Caleb arrived, breath fogging, hand raised in a calming gesture, the story had already begun to rewrite itself. He took statements, checked for injuries, watched Harper's hands tremble before she pressed them flat against Bear's chest until the shaking passed. He noted the absence of aggression. He noted the presence of control. It would not be enough. The headline arrived that afternoon, neat and cruel in its balance. Silent child and 5 guard dogs. Miracle or menace? It carried a photograph taken from across the street, angle compressed to make the dog seem larger, Harper smaller, context thinned as it traveled. By evening, comments piled up from strangers who had never felt harbor wind or watched a child count her steps to keep panic at bay. Experts opined without meeting anyone. The town felt crowded in a new way. Inside the wooden house, pressure mounted. Walter's chest tightened under the weight of attention he could not control. He woke at night gasping, palms slick, the memory of sirens too close to memory itself. Irene cried in the kitchen, silent tears falling into a sink already full. She worried she had failed twice, once as a mother who could not protect her son, and again as a grandmother who could not shield her granddaughter from the world's appetite. Harper watched all of it with a stillness that looked like calm and felt like drowning. Words gathered behind her teeth and refused to cross. Caleb checked in daily, careful not to intrude. He spoke to Gwen once, standing squarely, explaining what he had seen, what he had not. Gwen listened with her head tilted, fingers steepled. She thanked him for his service and dismissed his conclusions with a phrase she had perfected over decades. "We'll see." That night she drafted emails. What no one knew, what no one had known for months, lay buried beneath the harbor's routine. A truth small enough to be overlooked and heavy enough to bend lives. On the morning of the incident, before the crowd, before the shouting, before the photograph, Harper had noticed a change in Atlas. He had slowed, ears rotating inward, nostrils flaring with an intensity that had nothing to do with the cold. She had felt it then, a tug low in her chest that meant danger, the kind that did not wear a shape. Atlas's gaze had flicked from the pier to her and back again, a question asked and answered without sound. She had paused. The dogs had tightened. Seconds later, Martin Hale slipped. It was not the first time Atlas had done this. Weeks earlier, in the pre-dawn quiet when snow muffled the world and Irene slept with a heating pad wrapped around her knees, Walter had shuffled toward the back door to fetch wood. Atlas had risen from his place by the hearth, blocking the path with his body, eyes fixed on Walter's face. When Walter tried to step around him, Atlas pressed closer, whining once, low and urgent. Harper had woken to the sound padding down the hall in socks. She had seen the pallor in her grandfather's skin, the way his breath hitched. She had guided him to a chair, hand firm on his shoulder, while Atlas paced tight circles, head angled toward Walter's chest. By the time Irene arrived, the worst had passed, but the pattern lodged itself in Harper's mind like a warning etched in ice. Atlas sensed things before they happened. Not always, not perfectly, enough to matter. Harper had not told anyone. Secrets were easier than explanations, and explanations demanded words. But as the town divided and the pressure pressed in, the secret began to stir, restless as a thaw beneath snow. She watched Atlas more closely now, noted the moments when his focus sharpened beyond the ordinary. She matched her steps to his cues, slowed when he slowed, stopped when he fixed his gaze. The dogs trusted her to translate. She trusted them to keep her alive. Gwen's meetings grew louder, calls were made, forms were drafted. For the child's safety, she said, and believed it. Caleb filed his reports with care. Irene phoned relatives who could not help. Walter sat at the table staring at nothing, counting his breaths. And Harper walked. On the 5th day after the headline, snow fell thick and wet, the kind that weighs branches down until they crack. Harper took the harbor route again, avoiding the pier itself. Halfway down the path, Atlas slowed, then stopped dead. The dogs froze, breath steaming. Harper felt the tug again, stronger this time, a pressure behind her sternum that made her dizzy. She turned, eyes searching, and saw Walter at the end of the path, bundled and pale, waving weakly. He had followed her, worried she would be questioned alone, his pride overriding his caution. Atlas whined, sharp. Harper ran. She did not shout, she did not think. She reached Walter as his knees buckled, guided him to the bench. Fingers finding the pulse she had learned to find. Atlas pressed his head into Walter's chest and would not move. Juno stood guard. Bear blocked the path. Sable scanned for help. Knox darted off and returned with a bark that finally drew attention. Caleb arrived moments later, boots skidding, radio already in hand. Paramedics followed, breathless and efficient. Walter was stabilized, shaken but alive. People watched. Phones came up and went down. Someone whispered, "The dog knew." Harper knelt in the snow, hands numb, heart racing. Atlas's fur damp beneath her fingers. The secret had stepped into the open. She did not speak it. She did not need to. The truth had weight, and it pressed itself into the day. By evening, the town buzzed with a different energy. Fear did not vanish, but it cracked. Gwen stood at her window, watching lights flicker along the harbor, uncertainty tugging at the edges of her certainty. Caleb wrote a longer report than usual. Irene held Harper and let herself sob. Walter slept under observation, Atlas at his side. Port Haven did not heal, it paused. And in that pause, the awakening secret, small, specific, and undeniable, began to change the shape of what came next. The county building rose from the snow like a block of unfinished thought, concrete walls stained by decades of salt and thaw. Inside, the air smelled of paper, wool coats, and old heat. By the time Harper arrived with Irene, escorted quietly by Officer Caleb Sutter, the hallway outside the hearing room had filled with neighbors who pretended they were there for other reasons. Atlas walked at Harper's left knee, his head level with her elbow, sable coat brushed to a dull sheen. Juno and Bear flanked, Sable and Knox forming the rear, 5 shadows aligned as if the architecture itself had taught them where to stand. Marisol Vega arrived early and waited by the door with a slim folder pressed to her chest. She was in her mid-30s, olive-skinned, with dark hair cut to her collarbone and tucked behind one ear. Her suit was practical, charcoal, and unadorned, and her posture conveyed an effort to be present without imposing. Years working in child services had taught her to read rooms before entering them. She read this one now, Anxious, watchful, divided. When she smiled at Harper, it was small and careful, as if any larger gesture might shatter something fragile. Behind Marisol stood Dr. Owen Hart, the consulting psychologist. He was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with wire-rimmed glasses and a neatly trimmed beard peppered with gray. His hairline had receded in a way that suggested worry rather than vanity, and his eyes held the practiced softness of someone who had learned to wait out silence. He had once specialized in crisis response for first responders. A winter collapse years ago had ended his volunteer fieldwork and sharpened his patience. He carried a notebook but did not open it yet. The canine behavior specialist, Lila Chen, arrived last, boots dusted with snow, a parka slung over one arm. She was compact and athletic, early 40s, with a blunt black bob and hands that moved decisively, even when still. Her reputation preceded her in the region. She had trained disaster response dogs after storms and fires, and she did not romanticize animals. Function first, she liked to say. Her eyes traveled the length of the dogs without expression, noting stance, breathing, the absence of tension in the jaw. They took their seats. Gwen Marlowe entered moments later, chin lifted, scarf arranged with exacting symmetry. She carried a manila envelope thick with printouts, headlines, photographs pulled from search results, highlighted passages. Her gaze skimmed Harper without landing, then fixed on the bench where Judge Denise Klein would sit. Judge Klein entered to a hush. She was in her early 60s, tall, with iron gray hair, worn short and practical. Her face was square, mouth set firm not from cruelty, but from habit. She had served long enough to recognize theater when it entered her courtroom and was allergic to it. She surveyed the room, eyes sharp, then nodded once. "Let's proceed." Marisol spoke first, outlining the purpose of the hearing in a voice that carried without force. She described her visits to the wooden house, the observations made, the need to assess safety without erasing support. Dr. Hart followed, careful with his words, explaining selective mutism as a response to trauma, emphasizing that communication took many forms. Lila Chen added her assessment. No signs of aggression, high impulse control, handlers responding to cues that were subtle but consistent. "These dogs are working," she said plainly. "They're not freelancing." Gwen stood when her turn came, envelope opening with a crisp sound. She spoke of risk, of unpredictability, of precedent. She spoke as if stacking bricks, each concern aligned with the next. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When she finished, the room hummed with the echo of certainty. Harper sat very still. Irene's hand trembled in her lap. Walter had insisted on attending, despite the cold and the warnings, his coat buttoned too tight, his breath shallow but steady. He sat beside Irene, shoulders rounded, eyes closed for a moment longer than comfort allowed. Time stretched, then Atlas moved. It was not dramatic. He did not bark. He rose and began to circle Walter's chair in a tight, controlled loop, once, twice. His ears angled forward, nostrils flaring. He stopped and stared at Walter's chest, then turned his head to Harper and placed his muzzle against her hand with a pressure that was not a nudge, but a signal. Harper felt it, the old tug sharper now, a cold line down her spine. She stood without thinking. "Grandpa." "Going down," she said, the words thin and halting, each one an effort that left her throat burning. The room went silent as if the sound had sucked the air away. Walter slumped. Not a collapse, worse, a soft, dangerous sag. Irene cried out, Sable shifted to block the aisle. Bear planted his feet. Juno held her gaze on the door as if counting seconds. Harper guided Walter to the floor with a steadiness that did not belong to an 8-year-old. Atlas pressed close, his head hovering over Walter's chest, breath synchronized. Knox darted toward the back of the room and barked once, sharp and precise. "Call it in," Judge Klein said, already on her feet. Paramedics arrived quickly. Winter practiced into their hands. They took over with efficiency, murmuring numbers, checking monitors. One of them glanced at Atlas and then at the readout, eyebrows lifting. "He flagged early," he said quietly to his partner. Pressure dropped fast. Walter stabilized. Relief moved through the room like a thaw. Irene clutched Harper and sobbed. Harper's hands shook until Atlas leaned into her knees, and she leaned back. When order returned, it did so changed. Judge Klein cleared her throat. "We will take a brief recess," she said, "and when we resume, we will proceed with facts." During the break, Dr. Hart spoke softly to Marisol and Lila, piecing together the pattern that had been hinted at but not yet named. Lila nodded once. "Cardiac alert," she said. "Uncertified but real." Marisol looked at Harper, who was drawing slow circles in Atlas's fur, grounding herself. "We need to be careful," Marisol said, "but we need to be honest." When the hearing resumed, Judge Klein addressed the room directly. "What we witnessed was not conjecture," she said. "It was intervention." She turned to Gwen. "Your concerns are not dismissed. Safety matters, but so does evidence." Gwen stood again, and for the first time her composure wavered. She looked at the floor, then at Harper. Something tightened behind her eyes. She spoke of safeguards now, not removal, of oversight, not separation. It was a shift small enough to miss and large enough to matter. Harper did not speak again. She did not need to. Atlas lay at her feet, eyes half closed but alert, a steady weight against the storm that had passed through her body. The dog's formation relaxed by degrees, like a tide receding. Judge Klein concluded with measured clarity. The dogs would remain with Harper under specific conditions: public leashing in crowded areas, ongoing evaluations, medical consultation regarding Atlas's alert behavior. Services would be coordinated to support the family, not fracture it. The decision landed not as victory or defeat, but as a bridge. As the room emptied, snow fell outside with renewed insistence. Gwen lingered, envelope still in hand, watching Harper gather her coat. Caleb waited by the door, nodding once at the girl. Marisol closed her folder, exhaling. Dr. Hart scribbled a final note he would later revise. Lila Chen knelt briefly to Atlas's level, studying his eyes. "Good work," she murmured, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. Harper stepped into the cold with the dogs at her sides. The secret had been spoken without words, and the town, for all its noise, had listened. Winter did not loosen its grip on Port Haven simply because a judge had spoken. Snow kept falling, quieter now, as if the town were learning to breathe again. The order came down with conditions written in careful ink. The 5 dogs could remain with Harper under clear safety protocols: leashes in crowded areas, periodic behavioral evaluations, and coordinated medical oversight, alongside a therapeutic plan designed to strengthen what already existed rather than dismantle it. The work would be led by Dr. Nolan Price, a young veterinarian whose name traveled through the harbor like a rumor that did not sting. Dr. Price was 29, tall and narrow-shouldered, with sandy hair that refused to stay combed, and a habit of listening with his chin tucked down, eyes up. as if the world were something he approached from below. His skin held the faint redness of someone who spent more time outdoors than he intended, and his hands, long-fingered, steady, moved slowly, deliberately. He had grown up in a coastal town not unlike Port Haven, and had chosen veterinary medicine after a winter avalanche, took a friend and left behind a dog that waited 3 days beside a buried jacket. Nolan spoke softly, avoided jargon unless asked, and never rushed silence. He learned Harper's language the way one learns a tide chart, by watching, marking patterns, and waiting for confirmation. The first sessions were simple. Nolan sat on the floor of the wooden house, coat folded neatly beside him, while Harper stood with Atlas at her knee and the others arrayed behind. He mirrored her gestures imperfectly at first, correcting himself when Sable's ears flicked in doubt. He learned that a pause meant more than a command, that breath mattered, that hands spoke in angles rather than words. When Harper hesitated, Nolan did not fill the space. He let it be, and the dogs settled into it like stones into water, but the largest truth had not yet surfaced. It arrived one afternoon when the snow thickened and the porch rails disappeared under white. Gwen Marlowe came without an envelope this time. She stood beneath the eaves, shoulders hunched, camel coat buttoned unevenly, as if she had dressed in a hurry or forgotten the order of things. Her hair was still pinned, but a single silver strand had escaped and clung to her cheek. When Irene opened the door, Gwen removed her gloves with care she did not feel. "May I speak with Harper?" she asked, and the question held something close to fear. Harper stood with Atlas, her hand resting at the familiar place where his neck met shoulder. She did not look at Gwen. She looked at the snow collecting at her boots. Gwen began anyway, voice measured until it wasn't. She spoke of the night of the accident, of a call made too quickly, of a report she had heard and passed along without checking, urgency mistaken for certainty. She spoke of Evan and Molly changing their route to respond, of guilt that had sat like ice in her chest for a year and had found expression not in confession, but in control. "I thought," Gwen said, the word catching, "that if I could make things orderly, I could make them right." She did not claim to be the hand that struck. She named herself a stone in the slide. It was worse in a way, small negligence multiplied by consequence. Gwen offered restitution without bargaining, a fund for therapy and canine care, volunteers organized for storm days. Her own name attached where it could be held to account. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked to be honest. Harper listened. Atlas breathed. The dogs did not move. When Gwen finished, the snow sounded louder, the hush of it filling the space where words should have been. Harper lifted her eyes at last. Her mouth opened, closed. What came out was small and true. "I don't know how to hate," she said, the syllables trembling. "I'm just tired." Gwen bowed her head. The truth landed without ceremony, and that was its mercy. Spring came late, as it always did, but it came. Ice retreated in uneven lines along the harbor, revealing dark water that smelled like work and return. Harper's days took on a structure she could tolerate. School resumed on a flexible schedule. Mornings were short, afternoons quieter. Atlas wore a service vest that fit his broad chest, the fabric scuffed already from use. The other dogs had clear hours and routes, their work defined so they could rest without losing purpose. Children stared at first, curiosity bright and blunt. Atlas sat like a monument, eyes calm, tail still. Harper practiced sentences the way she practiced steps, one at a time, counting. When fear rose, she touched 2 fingers to her wrist. The dogs responded, closing the circle, steadying the air. Dr. Price expanded the program gently, introducing controlled challenges and documenting responses. He spoke to teachers in plain language, demystifying without diminishing. He consulted with cardiology about Atlas's alerts, setting parameters so no one confused instinct with infallibility. Walter recovered with caution. His breath remained fragile, but the days stacked into weeks without crisis. Irene laughed once, unexpectedly, at a kitchen mishap, and the sound startled them all into smiling. Port Haven learned in increments. Gwen stepped back from committees and took on quieter work, organizing rides, delivering meals, answering phones without titles. Caleb continued his rounds, nodding to Harper as she passed, hands open, watchful as ever. The harbor thawed. Snow melted into the cracks of the wooden house and ran away. On a clear morning, Harper walked the familiar path with Atlas at her side and the others in their measured places. She paused at the pier where the ice had broken into plates. She breathed. The dogs breathed with her. The road home stretched behind and ahead, no longer a corridor of fear, but a line she could follow, step by careful step, with shadows that knew how to listen. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes it arrives on 4 paws in steady breathing, in a warning felt seconds before danger strikes. Sometimes it arrives through a child who cannot speak, yet is heard more clearly than a room full of voices. In the Book of Kings, God did not appear in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but in a still, small voice. And in everyday life, that voice often wears ordinary forms. A loyal companion, a stranger who chooses truth over comfort. A moment where love steps forward before fear has time to act. Harper's story reminds us that God's protection does not always look the way we expect. It may look like discipline learned through kindness. It may look like silence that carries wisdom. It may look like a dog who listens to a heart long before any machine does. In our own lives, we walk crowded streets and quiet ones alike. We carry griefs no one can see. We make mistakes that ripple farther than we ever intended. And still, grace finds a way to meet us where we stand. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you of this simple truth. You are not walking alone. Whether through faith, through love, or through the quiet loyalty of those beside you, God often sends help before we even know we need it. May God watch over you and your family. May He place protectors on your path, seen and unseen. May He grant you the courage to choose truth, the humility to heal, and the peace to rest when the road feels long. If this message brought you hope, please share it with someone who might need encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your words matter more than you know. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of faith, loyalty, and quiet miracles unfolding in the ordinary moments of life. Until next time, walk gently, trust deeply, and believe that even in silence, God is still speaking.